No, thank you all so much. Thank you to Prime Minister Kishida, of course, to Ambassador Rahm Emanuel, to our friends and partners. It's wonderful to be here together again in a really challenging time. It's so good to be back in Tokyo, not socially distanced, not separated by plastic on the stage, being able to drink together tonight, seeing all of your faces. It's just a little normal at the person-to-person level. It's only when you get out of the person-to-person level that it stops being so normal. And you've heard that this morning already. And now I want to dive in. I really want to apologize in advance of this speech, because the state of the world today is very deeply broken. And I really should take my tie off. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Because, well, no, I mean, he's gone now, so we're okay. You know, I wore it for him, you know, I want to show respect. But that's all I'm taking off. I just want to be clear about that. So look, at last year's summit, you will remember I warned that our GZERO world, the lack of leadership in today's international order, and the geopolitical conflict that grows as a consequence, was gathering speed. Well, that acceleration is only increasing today. While the international cooperation that we have, the multinational institutions, the alliances, the global supply chains that we all rely on, are losing their ability to absorb shock. I mean, today, when we speak of war, I've got to specify which war we're talking about. I mean, is it the war that's remaking the security architecture of Europe? Or is it the war that's destabilizing the Middle East and threatening global religious conflict? Or is it the war that the Americans are fighting amongst themselves? I got to be clear. We don't want that. Also, serious doubts have emerged about the economic well-being of China, the nation that, along with the United States, has done most in recent decades to power our global economy. Just how problematic is China's post-pandemic recovery, and how are the anxieties in China from that weakness changing their already assertive foreign policy? Serious doubts have emerged about the political well-being of the United States. People no longer look surprised when I warn that the world's most powerful country has become the most politically divided and dysfunctional democracy of all the G7, though the United Kingdom is still competitive. For the U.S., 2024 is kind of like Voldemort. It's the year that we really don't want to talk about. But it's coming. So I'm going to open this morning talking about these urgent challenges for the coming year and the unprecedented, in my lifetime at least, dangerous state of global politics. That is the reality. Now, all of that said, there is more good news than you would expect. We just have to look for it. It's not on the headlines. Opportunities that are created by new international players and by new technologies. They all deserve our attention, and I will get there. But first, let's start with crisis. And let's start with the Middle East. Whenever we talk about Israelis and Palestinians, we've got to decide how deep we want to dig into the earth to expose the conflict's roots. But since we're talking about 2024, I'm going to resist going back decades and centuries. I want to start with the terrorist attacks of October 7th and the now 2-month war that has followed and that is expanding without guardrails. They come from two central realities, and you rarely will hear people talk about both of them. They usually mention one. One, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu knows that he cannot remain Israel's prime minister without active support from political parties who believe that God intends for Israel's Jews to live on land still settled by and legally claimed by Palestinians. And he has governed his country accordingly. That's a problem. Two, a total failure of leadership on the Palestinian side, aided by the Arab world more broadly and most every international actor that has been engaged in the Middle East conflict. That has allowed Hamas, a terrorist organization, to act on behalf of the Palestinian men, women, and children that they now use as human shields. Hamas is responsible for the murder of 1,200 Israeli citizens, more than 90% of them civilians. And in response, Netanyahu's government feels entitled to eradicate Hamas with little regard for the more than 2.3 million Palestinians who cannot escape the line of fire. Israeli defense forces are today fighting across the entirety of Gaza, and the killing and the killing and the killing continues. The United States government has at least a little leverage over Israel. They're the most important ally of the U.S. in the Middle East, though given the political challenges at home, they have less leverage than a lot of you would think. They're trying to influence the conduct of the war and the scale of the carnage. The Biden administration, working with Qatar and the United Nations, has helped to finally get humanitarian aid to the Palestinians, as well as securing the release of some, though not many, Israeli hostages, and Palestinians in Israeli custody have also been released. The U.S. has also pressed Israel to minimize civilian deaths as it works to destroy Hamas. But for almost all of the rest of the world, that is too little and too late. And the United States government today finds itself nearly alone in supporting the continued war. It's shocking to say the U.S. today is as isolated on this issue globally as Russia was when Putin invaded Ukraine 2 years ago. That's shocking, but it's true. Now, Biden has had more success, at least so far, in avoiding a massive expansion of the war beyond the borders of Israel and Gaza. But that work is getting much more difficult as the next phase of the war in Gaza advances. And as we've just seen, the Houthis in Yemen are expanding their attacks on American military vessels and commercial transit. U.S. officials know that Iran has leverage. They have material and moral support for those Houthis, for Hezbollah in Lebanon, for Hamas, and for militant groups in Iraq and Syria. They are funding, they are training, they are arming these forces. They're not directly ordering the attacks, but there's no question they are happy to see them. And when it comes to Israel, there are no differences of opinion between Iran and these terrorist groups. They do not recognize the right of Israel to exist. There are no circumstances where Biden will renounce the U.S. alliance with Israel. It is not possible. But the United States has lost permanently some of its support for Israel going forward. U.S. public opinion is changing along with nations' demographics. Younger people increasingly support the Palestinian position, and more Americans are publicly questioning the continued occupation of the West Bank and even Israel's basic commitment to democracy. I mean, they're questioning America's commitment to democracy too, but I will get there. These concerns are going to grow. We are no closer to resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict today than we were 6 weeks ago. I want to be clear that there are no guardrails on this conflict. Right now it's getting worse, and we don't see a snapback. Now let's go to Russia-Ukraine. And that's the war that no one is asking me about anymore, which is annoying to me because I wrote my PhD dissertation on Russians in Ukraine back in 1994. So you're going to have to humor me on this issue, right? At last year's summit, I noted that Russia controlled about 20% of Ukraine's territory, and that Ukrainian forces were unlikely to ever fully evict Russian soldiers. Today, 12 months later, almost nothing has changed. And that which has changed has also been negative. Again, a conflict that for now does not have guardrails. In the past year, Vladimir Putin followed through on threats to exit a deal, which was agreed with the United Nations, allowing Ukraine to export grain through the Black Sea. He also formally annexed some of his occupied land into the Russian Federation, though almost nobody in the world actually recognizes it. Ukraine's counteroffensive has moved the front line less than 25 kilometers since the operation began this past summer. And since Ukraine in the last few days has started putting out defensive fortifications, it's safe to say their counteroffensive is over. Now, in Russia, we had that sudden failed mutiny aside, and I'll say the name Prigozhin because after that I'm never going to have to mention it again, which is kind of nice. But Putin's strategic position has improved over the past year. It's certainly improved over the past 2 months. There are questions about the staying power of Ukraine's main backers in America and Europe. In the U.S. in particular, the Kremlin is encouraged that Republicans increasingly do not want to spend money on Ukraine. And that is particularly true when Trump gets the nomination and when the Republican Party gets behind him. Zelensky, not Putin, now faces increased pressure to move to a negotiated settlement. Putin's standing is less isolated. The Gaza war has helped Moscow argue that Americans are a bunch of hypocritical neo-colonialists who care more about power than about the lives of innocent people. And this message plays very well across the global South, which is why Prime Minister Kishida and his announcement to do more there with the United States is so welcome. It also creates more divides in the transatlantic alliance, which rallied so effectively in the first year and a half of the war. Now, in the last few weeks, Russia has expanded missile strikes across Ukraine to the highest levels that we have seen this year. High oil prices mean that Russia has been able to increase their domestic production of missiles to greater levels than they had before the war started. North Korea sending them a lot of ammunition. By the way, China's not happy about that. I was just in Beijing. They didn't hear that Putin was meeting with Kim Jong-un in Vladivostok until after the invitation. They were not happy about that. Interesting aside. And Iran, of course, is also building drones on the ground in Russia. If Russia does an additional troop mobilization in 2024, I don't see Ukraine matching it. So it's possible that we could be looking at Russia that could take more territory, a complete shift in how we've been thinking about the future of this war. In Europe, there's still lots of support for Ukrainian refugees, but individual countries are getting tired, and they have much less capacity to absorb refugees or pay for the financial help for the war effort. And that means that Europe is becoming less certain for its economic support of Ukraine, just as the United States is becoming less certain in its military support for Ukraine. And of course, if Donald Trump is actually elected president again in the United States in November, which is about a coin flip right now, Putin's hope for success grow significantly. We know what the outcome is. We don't want to say it, its partition. Ukraine can't get their land back. Now, no one's going to say that publicly, though I just did, I guess. But nobody else, all right? It is unacceptable to the U.S., to Europe, and to the Ukrainians that they're going to lose and split their country to the Russians. It's unacceptable. But we live with lots of things that are unacceptable. North Korea's nuclear arsenal, Assad in power in Syria, the end of democracy in Venezuela. That word, unacceptable, it's like the Princess Bride. It doesn't mean what we think it means. The critical question in the coming months is, can the U.S. and Europe provide enough security and economic guarantees that they can continue to plausibly be aligned with each other and Zelensky and the Ukrainian government? Can they create a European and NATO future for at least the majority of the Ukrainians, certainly not for all, that they still have control over? This does not resolve the war. Ukraine risks losing. I do not see Russia winning. Whatever longer-term gains Russia's forces can make on the ground in Ukraine, NATO is expanding. This month, the EU is opening a process for membership for Ukraine, for Georgia, for Moldova, 3 former satellites in the Soviet Union. That was an option that wasn't on the table before Putin invaded Ukraine. Russia has faced now 11 rounds of sanctions from the Europeans, the Americans, more coming. Half of its sovereign assets have been frozen, included by Japan. Europe's not going to buy Russia's commodity exports anymore. Have to be sold to China and India on the cheap. And Moscow is much more dependent on China. All of this damage for pieces of eastern and southern Ukraine that will take years and years to consolidate. And this leaves us with a bigger problem. Russia is on the road to permanent rogue state, pariah, war criminal status. Seriously in decline and seriously angry at the West. It's the first time that's ever been true of a G20 economy, never mind one with 6,000 nuclear weapons. I suspect that we won't be talking as much about Ukraine next year. I'm going to have to get over it. But I fear we are going to be talking a lot more about Russia. Now, I just came from Beijing last week, and the economic situation in China is very serious. And it's very easy to explain. The China growth engine doesn't work the way it used to. We've had 40 years of extraordinary expansion. That's over. Youth unemployment stands at record highs, so high that the Chinese are no longer publishing that data. I don't think that fixes the problem. Manufacturing activity is contracting. The property sector, which is 1/5 of the economy and 2/3 of China's household wealth and 40% of the collateral held by its banks, is in serious trouble. Exports have declined on the back of inflation and historically high interest rates in the U.S. and Europe. Foreign investment has turned negative into China for the first time since we've recorded data. Property prices are declining. Household wealth is contracting, and borrowers don't want to underwrite property construction going forward, which means a wave of defaults from developers and lenders. Revenues for local governments are drying up, and their debt servicing costs are rising. Domestic demand is stagnant. Consumer sentiment is down. Growth is slowing. And China's government response has been limited and incremental. Large-scale bailouts are off the table, at least for now. Now, look, headline growth in China might well come in at 5% this year, but the economy faces deflation because of persistently weak consumer spending, slowing private investment, mounting financial stress. Next year's growth target might be high, but the leadership is right to focus more on the quality of growth rather than its absolute level. The IMF now expects the Chinese economy to grow under 4% a year for the coming years. Eurasia Group is more bearish than that. And of course, demographics, high debt, and geopolitical competition, especially with the United States, is making that bad situation worse. Critically, the Chinese people seem to be worrying that the next generation will not be better off than the present one for the first time since the 1980s. And the increasingly centralized, opaque, and dare I say capricious nature of Chinese policymaking, not to mention a bunch of really disruptive policies like tech crackdowns and the zero COVID lockdowns and the sudden exit from them overnight. Everyone gets COVID from zero COVID. Not to mention the raids on the foreign firms that Japan has had to deal with. All of that creates more uncertainty and has undermined confidence. Now, there is a positive story here. And that positive story is that China remains a pretty highly competitive economy with lots of advantages in manufacturing, renewable energies, electric vehicles, and lots of global innovation in advanced computing, AI, biotech. They've got an educated workforce, increasingly world-class infrastructure, and an innovation ecosystem that is a real source of strength. China is also very politically stable, which means that President Xi can avoid the temptation to shift to debt-fueled, unsustainable growth if he chooses. Only a systemic financial contagion or mass protests, neither of which I would count on in 2024, is going to force Xi's hand. And that means he's just going to add stimulus at the margins and call on the Chinese people to persevere. Now, the risk is that the wrong policy choices means that China's economy is in a scenario of deflation, stagnant growth, and high indebtedness. We've seen this in Japan back in the 90s, but China's at a much lower level of development. The big silver lining that we have seen over the last several months, and that we've already heard Ambassador Emmanuel talk about, is the charm offensive, the smile diplomacy that we have witnessed over the past few months, which I think will remain strong. Because even if it's a tactical retreat, and it doesn't reflect a change of heart for Xi, all of these economic and geopolitical problems aren't going to get resolved soon. The question is, how much can a smile diplomacy accomplish, and where does a thaw open up short-term opportunity for both governments and businesses, which I believe that Japan will soon take advantage of. I think that the seafood export ban, I think that the espionage focus, I think those will get resolved at the expert level over the next couple of months by the Japanese and the Chinese. And that is a positive story. In the same way that the fentanyl deal with the U.S. is one of the biggest positive stories that we've seen between the U.S. and China in decades, and takes a big issue, a crisis, off of the election debate. We had a very productive meeting between Xi and Biden at the APEC summit. And when I was in Beijing last week, every official I talked to was hopeful that that can continue. So unlike the conflicts I've just talked about in the Middle East and in Russia-Ukraine, the U.S.-China relationship has interdependence and does actually have guardrails. And in an environment of great instability, that is meaningful for the world. Now, we still see conflicts. These two countries are heading towards a path of technology Cold War, export controls from the U.S. on semiconductors, soon on cloud computing. That'll be announced in the next few weeks. And from the Chinese, more and more on critical minerals around electric vehicles and supply chain for transition energy. But the Biden-Xi meeting and the months of careful diplomacy that led up to it reminds us that these governments in both countries are adults. It's not Russia, it's not North Korea, it's not Iran, right? Both prefer stability to chaos. Both is trying to contain the damage from international emergencies. So while both countries have very different views on Ukraine and on Israel, they've both carefully avoided taking action that would expand the fallout of those wars. Especially with the economic challenges I just mentioned for China,
Beijing remains geopolitically risk-averse, with the exception of in their backyard, areas that Beijing considers sacrosanct for their own sphere of influence. And in my trip to Beijing last week, the only place that came up on that was Taiwan, the red line. We'll go to war if they demand independence. And that, of course, an election is coming. TAC already mentioned it, January 13th. It looks like the pro-independence vice president is likely to win, and Beijing is warning that their cross-strait relations will be harmed by that. But I still think that even in the worst case, neither the United States nor China are in a position to start a destructive and unpredictable conflict over Taiwan, given everything else happening in the world. The fact is that the U.S. and China relationship today looks like an oasis of stability compared to most of the headlines. I don't know if that's good news or bad news, but I'll take it. Okay, finally on the bad news front, let me move to America's political dysfunction. Because even though the economy is doing very well in the U.S., the system is in crisis. How dysfunctional is it? Well, I mean, earlier this year, personal rivalries among Republican lawmakers in the House left them without a speaker and therefore unable to pass any legislation. First time in 160 years. So I don't remember the last time, in other words. The last time divisions within the House stopped business that way, the main issue dividing them was the legal status of slavery. So now we face the 2024 presidential election. I can't avoid it, much as I'd like to. And we are on track for a rematch. It's Biden, and it's almost certainly former President Donald Trump. The polls are painting a pretty bleak picture. 37% of Americans approve of Biden's performance as president. That's it. 65% don't want him to vote again. More than 70% of likely voters say that the 81-year-old Biden is too old for the job. On the other side, we've got the twice impeached, twice acquitted Trump. Let's briefly review the record. You got to say it. After he was defeated for re-election in 2020, I'm going to say it, he was defeated for re-election in 2020. That's controversial in the United States right now. Trump refused to concede, created a plan to remain in power that's landed him in court, and incited a violent insurrection to stop the certification of Biden's victory. Trump has been indicted in 4 separate criminal cases, 91 charges, and unless he is elected next year, he faces prison. In a civil case, a jury found charges that Trump had raped a woman in the mid-1990s to be substantially true. It's insanity. Just 38% of Americans approve of his 4 years as president. 60% don't want him back in the White House. But he now leads all other Republican candidates by over 30 points. Can Trump be president again? Absolutely. If there were an election held today, he would win. The outcome for next November, I have no idea. But it's damn close. You heard that from TAC. I didn't hear Rahm saying that wasn't true. I know what Rahm wants, and I know what Rahm thinks is likely. And he's worried. Everyone's worried. Everyone's worried. Look, poll numbers a year before the election are of limited value. And back in 2011, President Obama had ugly polling, and he still won re-election. Biden does have an important advantage. There's never been an American history election in which the challenger's reputation matters at least as much as the president's. And that's going to make this race very, very hard to forecast. But for now, we can say that an economic slowdown in 2024, further age-related decline for Biden, and he is slowing down a lot in person, deeper fractures over Israel among Democrats, and early court victories for Trump would further reduce Biden's chances. But a U.S. economy that avoids recession, which looks likely, age-related decline for Trump, and if you watch him giving his speeches, he's also falling apart intellectually. Policy overreach on abortion, especially from congressional Republicans. would all tip the scales further in Biden's favor. But in the meantime, other governments, allies and rivals of the U.S. are already calculating the opportunities, the costs, the risks that U.S. elections are creating for them. In Beijing, and in Tel Aviv, and in Brussels, and here in Tokyo, policymakers have to reckon with an unprecedentedly uncertain U.S. election outcome that will dramatically impact the global role of the world's most powerful economy. In Beijing last week, every leader I spoke to told me they were more worried about the U.S. political situation in 2024 than over Taiwan, than over the South China Sea, than over technology. In Japan, every question so far is like, what is happening in the United States? It's the world's most powerful country. And by the way, it's not just about November. Trump's going to get the nomination, probably around March. When he gets the nomination, he is in charge of the Republican Party. He gets the money, he gets all the politicians, he gets the media, he gets the alignment of the leaders. So suddenly, from March to November, it is no longer Biden versus the Republicans. It's Biden versus whatever Trump says. If he says no more support for Ukraine, Republicans move in that direction. If he says, I want to ban Muslims from coming to the U.S., Republicans move in that direction. This becomes an issue for Japan. Plan A, Plan B, Plan C. Tack's got all of them. Talk to him afterwards. He's got plans, right? But we have to focus on this much sooner than November. It's not just a coin flip. This is coming. Okay. But before I close, I have to leave you with some positive stories. A few, right? A few. And as it turns to 2024, I think they are a lot. They get not much attention, but they matter. And I thought I wanted to spend, I don't usually do this, but the backdrop is so challenging. We do top risks every year. The backdrop is so challenging. Let's talk about top opportunities. I want to start with India. India, of course, it's very politically stable. Modi's got 70% approval. He's just won a couple local elections in the last 24, 48 hours. He's going to win again. He's going to have another 5 years. They've got strong growth. It's great for the global economy. But that's not why I'm mentioning India. I'm mentioning India because they have a critical role as a bridge between leadership of the global South on the one hand and a strong relationship with the U.S., Japan, and Europe on the other. It is impossible to overstate the geopolitical importance of that fact. Much of the developing world, the global South that the Prime Minister just talked about, feels alienated from the West, especially from the U.S., the pandemic, climate change, Russia, Ukraine, the Middle East. They endured all of that. They see the industrial countries not paying attention to them. Even at COP, shrugging off willingness to write checks to pay for global damages. They see how much the West cares about Ukrainians who are white and don't care about people in other parts of the world. This annoys them. This is angering them. But when India, the biggest, the strongest economy in the developing world, a country whose independence of thought and action is not in question, works to strengthen its relations with the U.S. and the G7, that is the strongest possible recommendation for pragmatism between the global South and the West. This role as bridge is critical for making global architecture and institutions more stable. It also prevents China from leading an anti-G7 BRICS partnership and becoming a counterweight to the G7. By the way, India is one of the only major countries in the world where the 2024 election in the U.S. doesn't matter. They've got a really good relationship with Biden. They've got a really good relationship with Trump. It doesn't matter. Japan thinks it doesn't matter because Abe was masterful at handling it. It matters for Japan. India's okay. I don't know where India's going long term, but for now and for the foreseeable future, the world has picked up much more geopolitical resilience from the role that India plays. Okay, second one, Europe. There's no question Europe has all sorts of economic challenges in 2024. A lot of populism, low economic growth, but crises that Europe has dealt with, the pandemic, climate change, the Russian invasion, and Brexit, has made the multinational political commitment to the world's most ambitious experiment in supranational governance, which I'm saying in part because the EU ambassador is about to get on stage, right? Much, much stronger as an institution. The EU today has more centralized authority over fiscal and economic challenges, over climate and energy policy, over data policy, over health policy than it ever has before. And a stronger EU means that Eurosceptics in France, in Italy, in other EU states don't have the political strength that they otherwise might. In Italy, Meloni has moderated her country's economic populism because she needs Europe. In Poland, they just pushed out the Eurosceptic government, the illiberal government. Viktor Orbán in Hungary knows he needs money. So as a consequence, he's got to play ball with Brussels. We've seen populist scoring gains recently in Netherlands and Slovakia, in Germany, but none of this has genuinely undermined the strength of the European Union. And I don't think they'll matter to EU elections next year either. I've been saying great stuff about Europe. Just want to let you know that. Since you missed it all, it was really only for you. So, oh, you got it. Okay, that's good. So there's plenty of anger still directed at Brussels and the bureaucracy, but the social contract of the European Union has never been seen as stronger, more resilient, or more necessary. I think that's essential. And the Japanese understand that a lot better than the Americans do. Okay, a couple more quick ones. Mexico. We never talk about Mexico and Japan. They've got elections in 2024, and their term, you only get one term as president. It's got to step down. That's not the issue. Issue is Mexico is a dynamic economy. It's strongly integrated into U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, and it's a lead beneficiary of the growing source and trend of nearshoring. It helps that they're the lead trade partner of the world's largest economy, the U.S. But they're also politically stable, they're politically predictable. And their incoming president, that I expect to win, Claudia Sheinbaum, who's the former mayor of Mexico City, she's not only has the support of their enormously popular outgoing president, AMLO, but unlike AMLO, she actually understands economics. She's a committed technocrat. She's also a former climate scientist. The business community likes her through her work in Mexico City. And it's also a country with one of the largest and most talented bureaucratic classes in the world that she, unlike AMLO, will try to use. I think that's a very big deal. She's got credibility, and just as India can bridge the global south and the G7, Sheinbaum can create more opportunities and more links between North, Central, and South America, which is the most geopolitically stable region of the world, something that matters a lot more when we're talking about wars everywhere and everyone buying more guns. This push for greater hemispheric integration in the world's most stable region will be important for years to come. I don't think that domestic politics will allow for a multilateral trade deal across the region, a hemispheric trade deal, but we are going to see something stronger and more durable than the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity emerge in the Western Hemisphere. Something close to a US-led Belt and Road-style project for the Americas, bolstered by new tech, new energy investments and alignment with support from a reinvigorated World Bank. And since I'm talking about the Western Hemisphere, and since I've been so negative about Washington, let me talk a little bit about the positive stories in the United States. It's not about Washington, nothing about Washington here. But even though Americans hold their national political institutions in historically low regard, that is not true at the local level. In fact, the decentralization of U.S. politics has allowed for a free market of political strategies that is driving some of the most remarkable growth and human capital attraction in the developed world. You got the blue states that vote Democrats. The Bay Area, Northern California, Silicon Valley is now leading the way in global artificial intelligence development, the most important new sector that covers every sector in some ways in the world. And that is creating enormous economic turnaround in San Francisco, which has had inequality and blight. My own New York City, arguably the world's most global metroplex for its availability of capital and its power to attract diverse top-level talent. It's also the epicenter of global finance. But I'm not just talking about blue states, red states, those that support Republicans. Texas has not only rebounded to hit record levels of fossil fuel production, which Biden never talks about, but also has seen explosive growth in post-carbon energy production and supply chains. And Texas now leads the United States in the production of both kinds of energy. It's a world power. It's bigger than a lot of OPEC. And South Florida, also red state, ability to attract and drive finance, banking, and tech is powering one of the most remarkable surges in inbound investment and growth around the world. And I say all of this because I want you to remember the economic scale. Florida's economy is larger than Turkey's. New York's larger than South Korea's. Texas, about the same as Italy. California, the same as Britain. So the blue and red states, these are radically different growth models, but the decentralization of political and economic power nationally allows the U.S. to become a laboratory of competing geopolitical and socioeconomic experiments that are on the scale of major industrialized countries. And since Ram already mentioned it, I should at least add the record levels of federal infrastructure investment, industrial policy from the Biden administration, job creation from Trump and Biden through the pandemic. So there's good reason to believe that despite all the political dysfunction, the United States will still have plenty of growth. So I did want to spend a little bit of time, right, after all of the geopolitical tragedy to talk about some of the geopolitical opportunity. And these are not small things. These are big things. I hope that over the course of the day, we can spend some time on balance, on resilience. You will note that I have not spent much time talking about Japan. And I have to say, for the Americans here, we've got to be a little surprised that Prime Minister Kishida's approval ratings have been so low. Given, frankly, how well he is received and thought of in Washington and in the American business community. But Japan is not a big risk. It's not a maker of geopolitical risk. It's a taker of geopolitical risk. Japan is also not the big opportunity on the list. But Japan is something that we need more of in my speech and in the world. You know, when I look at the United Nations, an organization that the Americans created, and I'm very proud of that. But increasingly, if you go to the US, you'll see a lot of people criticizing the UN, saying it's a bad organization, we don't trust it. We've got the former ambassador right here. She's going to be on stage shortly. She understands the importance. But a lot of people say that. I think it's because we're a little ashamed that when we look at the UN, we're seeing ourselves in a mirror and we see that we don't reflect a lot of the values that we built in 1945. Japan reflects those values. Japan reflects those values today. In fact, Japan is the largest, most powerful country in the world that reflects the values that the Americans stood for so proudly at the end of World War II. The rule of law, the transparency, the multilateralism, the desire to actually consider the well-being of 8 billion people on the planet, and not just the small number of citizens that we connect with every day on social media. I can't say how important that is. It makes me very proud to have started our GZERO summits here in Tokyo as opposed to anywhere else in the world. We've worked here for so long with so many of you as partners. You're trusted, you're friends, and as long as I can still be around. We lost Kissinger this last week, but I'm not going anywhere, right? I mean, you know, you've got, I apparently have almost 50 years to go at this point, so you're stuck with me. And I want to, on that note, thank you all very much for listening, for joining us. And I think that we're going to have a very exciting day. Thank you very much.